And today we begin Developmental Psychology. Unfortunately, the book that I normally use didn't give a great introduction, so I put this slideshow together because they literally had no resources. I'm aware that it's not as ideal as many of my other lectures. Hopefully I'm going to spend time in the future and just redo this one. But I wanted to get this up for some of my students who are already needing it. Again, this is Introduction to Developmental Psychology. Your discussion question is, are you the same person you were a few years ago? Give you a second to think about that. For the majority of people, really, the answer should be no. I know a very smart person, well, maybe very wise, maybe not so much smart, but certainly wise, who said people aren't really people until they're 30. Because people change, and that's part of what we cover in developmental psychology. Certainly, the vast majority of people watching this lecture are likely going to be somewhere college age. That's actually who it's intended for. College people are very different from what they were just last year. And certainly just a few years before that, just because of how much rapid changing is occurring in this situation right here, right in the then and now. So, are you the same person? Well, at least it's something to think about. Here is your joke. There aren't a lot of good developmental jokes, so I took what I could get. What should a bird nourish its chick with to ensure proper development? Red Bull, because Red Bull gives you wings. Disclaimer, don't actually give your bird Red Bull. It's probably not good for them. Lifespan perspective. That's generally how we seek out and learn and look at stuff like developmental psychology. And really, what is development? It is that movement change that begins at conception and continues through the lifespan. We're really constantly changing, constantly developing, improving ourselves generally, and everything is constantly in this build-up to what we are eventually going to become. Why study developmental psychology? Well, it can certainly give us insight into our lives and other people's lives. It can help us interact with other people, regardless of where we are on that lifespan and where everybody else is. Most of us are at some point going to become parents, and this can help prepare us at least a little bit for parenthood. Or if you're not going to become a parent and you're just going to go into some form of education or teaching, which some teaching components in an awful lot of jobs, it can prepare us for that too. It also can help us understand the aging process. Whether we like it or not, we're all going to, at some point, get old and or watch somebody else that we are close to also get old. Characteristics of lifespan development. Well, first of all, it's lifelong. It does start from conception until old age, pretty continuously until we pass away. There are also many dimensions of this. We can, of course, think of relationships, mind, emotion, as well as the physical changes that we're all familiar with. All of these things are, in fact, constantly changing. Multi-directional means all of these dimensions, mind, emotions, physical stuff, they're constantly expanding or shrinking depending on what part of the lifespan that you're in. It's possible that when you perhaps hit teenager, you're more interested in social relationships than perhaps working on your mind. So that component of relationships would expand while maybe the mind would shrink. That's of course is of course partially variable to the person, but there are some tendencies as well. very plastic, malleable. Some of these things can change. When we're looking at stuff like how many disciplines are involved, there's very much a lot of disciplines that can be involved in lifespan development, and that includes psychology, anthropology, such as how our culture treats the elderly, sociology, that's how society treats the elderly, and while there is some crossover with anthropology, it's not necessarily the same. There's of course biology. Really, any of the medical stuff would be interested in the physical areas of development. We also have to look at stuff by context, such as age graded, which means that some people, we know that there are some things that we have to do. All of these things depend on, some things depend on where we are in our life. We know at a certain time, we're going to be walking, roughly. We know at a certain age, puberty should be either well underway or should be about ready to start. We know that we are expected to get married at a certain time. And eventually we're probably going to go through menopause or andropause. History graded is really asking what is going on in the world that might be affecting development. Certain cases, such as there could be a war that could change how we have affected, how we are affected mentally. That could also have led to some type of maybe nutritional deficit impacting our physiology. Could also be a plague, which could affect a whole lot of things as well. Non-normative events are things that would be more specific to the individual when it comes down to it. All of this is also going through growth, maintenance, and loss. We're all going through all of these things together. Really, and everything is really looking at biology, culture, as well as the individual. So all of these things and more are really together when we're talking about lifespan development. The nature of development, we can look at three major sections. The first one should come as no surprise to anybody. That's biological processes. These are the physical changes that we go through from the time we're born until we go and pass away. It's also the cognitive processes that changes in thought, intelligence, and all sorts of related functions such as those. Socio-emotional processes are the changes in relationships, emotions, and personality traits. There are some things that do change over the course of our lifetime. When we're talking about development, usually we'll see something along the 8 stages that are listed on this slide. Some books give a different set of 8. Some of them don't include prenatal, for example. Some might break apart childhood even more. Some people might break apart adolescence even more. So this is just generally how we usually see it, but it is possible you'll see something else as well. The first stage is prenatal development. Well, basically conception until birth. It's not really easy for us as psychologists to really test, but it should still be included. Stage 2, infancy to toddlerhood, which is birth through age 3. Early childhood, they usually think of it as the preschool ages, so ages 3 through 5. Middle childhood, well, it depends on really where puberty occurs, which is why on this slide it says 6 through 10, or it also says or 12. Really, this is partially dependent really on puberty. But 6 through 10 or 6 through 12 is roughly where people are thinking. So think about it as 1st grade through 5th or 1st grade through 7th if you're in the United States. That's roughly where that would be. Adolescence starts really at puberty and goes into your late teens to early 20s, depending on how you specifically what you're really looking at. There is some discussion as to when adolescence starts and stops. Usually starts is mostly consistent around puberty, but the stops is kind of controversial right now. Some people say at age 18, when we become legal adults in the United States. Some people say early 20s, like 21. Some people have argued for 25. Some people have even argued for 30. So that is a little bit up for discussion. Early adulthood, sorry about that, is usually the 20s through 30s, roughly, around the time that some people still argue that adolescence is still occurring. Of course, there's also middle adulthood, 40s through 50s, and late adulthood, which is 60s to death. There are also different patterns of aging. Most of us are going to fall into what is called normal aging. It's just how most of us are going to age similarly at similar times, similar speed, etc. But there are also two other options. One is also pathological aging, which I would dare say most people really don't want to have, but that's a greater decline of health than would be usual. And successful aging, which is really what we should be really striving for, is a slower decline of health. I have a good example of some friends that were close to my family. Their names were Will and Fran. There was the husband and wife. Fran was 12 years younger than Will was, but she was already old when I was little, while he really didn't strike me as anything close to his age. I always used to think that she was actually older, so I hope none of their kids end up hearing this video. But there was a 12-year age difference. Will was 12 years older. He ended up, being very, very active until, just a little bit before he died. He ended up passing away from a complication from a surgery, a little heart valve replacement. But he was still a very, very active man until basically that surgery. He ended up passing away in his early 80s, like age 83. Fran, who actually was who, like I said, was kind of old when she was in her 50s. She already acted like she was 80 or 90. She acted older than my great-grandmother at the time. She had a much more quick decline, and she just kind of held on until her early 90s. She passed away at the age of 92. But they said she was old before then. So I think that these two as great examples of successful aging, which was Will still being very active into his early 80s, and she didn't do so well and ended up many years in a nursing home. And realistically, she was again old when I was when I was young, and she was probably only in her 50s or 60s at the time. But she struck me as ancient. Like I said, I always thought that she was older than Will. But those are at least an example of that. You guys have probably all seen somebody in your own life that seems to be looking and acting really good for their age. So that could be a sign of them aging very successfully. And surely a lot of people know some people who are seem to already be old when they're young because they're declining so quickly. Nature of development. There are several things that we really consider when we deal with the nature of development. The first one is this concept of nature versus nurture. When it comes down to it, everything in development relates back to nature versus nurture in some way. Most things are a mixture of both of them, although there are people still very adamant on each side of those camps. If you guys are ever taking an advanced developmental class, that is something to make note of. I had a professor that actually told me if you mention how nature versus nurture relates to any of these articles, because we had to write a paper every week on every article. I'm going to give it a 0 because nature versus nurture is so in depth, in this concept of developmental psychology. So just assume everything has something to do with that. Development also has this concept of stability versus change. Basically, things are stable and consistent until they're not, which seems to make perfect sense, but that is one of those things that we need to consider. When you look at continuity versus discontinuity, that's still talking about that gradual or more abrupt change. So for some of the theories that we going to eventually be discussing, it's the change is really almost seems to be almost non-existent. So it's kind of like a stair step. Some people gave that an example of like a computer's, getting an upgrade. Apparently, in my department, until very recently, everything was still running Windows 7, and they finally told everybody that they were going to upgrade everybody's computers to Windows 10, which is actually about to be on the outs and outs now. But that would be a sudden upgrade with that OS. Probably not a really major one, and not as nearly as major as if you went from Windows 3.1 to Windows 10. That would be really big. But it is still a change to consider. There are a lot of theories that relate to developmental psychology. So we're going to briefly go over several of them very briefly, and I'm going to show video for most of them. The first one is Freud's theory. Most people are very familiar with Sigmund Freud, usually thinking about just having, say, 3 stages. Well, he actually does have 5. I don't recall this coming up on the Psych GRE, but I did want to mention that so that if anybody is watching this, they is in preparation, they can at least say, "Yep, we covered that." Great. So he had his 5 stages. Oral, as anybody who's spent a lot of time with the kids know, babies always put everything in their mouth. They're very interested in using their mouth for pretty much everything. A little bit later, people become basically obsessed with their butt. And some people honestly never seem to grow out of that stage. Later is the phallic stage, which is basically, you'll see this mostly with the young men, everybody is obsessed with their penis. Now, they're not interested in necessarily doing anything with it. They're not interested in sexual activity just yet, but they're obsessed with having it. Again, some men have never grown out of that stage either. There's also then this latency period where it's like they're definitely not interested in, and oral not really as big, anal not really as big, phallic not really as big. It's just kind of like this dormant period. And then all of a sudden, the different sexes start liking each other, and now people actually want to do something with their penises. So that's when we get into the genital stage, and basically everybody is obsessed with sex. Now we can think about Erik Erikson and his theory. His whole theories involved different forms of conflict and at different parts of your life. So you start off as trust versus mistrust, then you go on to autonomy versus shame doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus confusion, intimacy versus isolation, that's stage 6, stage 7, generativity versus stagnation, and finally integrity versus despair. All of these occur at key different times in your life. Usually by the time you are becoming an adult, a legal adult in the U.S., you should be somewhere in, going into stages 6 and on. Stages 1 through 5 typically occur before the age of 20. But I have a video for that one, which might explain things a little bit more. Plus, you will cover all of this if you go into a more in-depth developmental psychology course.
Erikson's theory of psychosocial development identifies 8 stages which a healthy individual should pass through from birth to death. At each stage, we encounter different needs, ask new questions, and meet people who influence our behavior and learning. Stage 1. Basic trust versus mistrust. As infants, we ask ourselves if we can trust the world, and we wonder if it's safe. We learn that if we can trust someone now, we can also trust others in the future. If we experience fear, we develop doubt and mistrust. The key to our development is our mother. Stage 2. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. In our early childhood, we experience ourselves and discover our body. We ask, is it okay to be me? If we are allowed to discover ourselves, then we develop self-confidence. If we are not, we can develop shame and self-doubt. Both parents now play a major role. Stage 3. Initiative versus guilt. In preschool, we take initiative, try out new things, and learn basic principles like how round things roll. We ask, is it okay for me to do what I do? If we are encouraged, we can follow our interests. If we are held back or told that what we do is silly, we can develop guilt. We are now learning from the entire family. Stage 4. Industry versus inferiority. Now we discover our own interests and realize that we are different from others. We want to show that we can do things right. We ask if we can make it in this world. If we receive recognition from our teachers or peers, we become industrious, which is another word for hard-working. If we get too much negative feedback, we start to feel inferior and lose motivation. Our neighbors and schools now influence us the most. Stage 5. Identity versus role confusion. During adolescence, we learn that we have different social roles. We are friends, students, children, and citizens. Many experience an identity crisis. If our parents now allow us to go out and explore, we can find identity. If they push us to conform to their views, we can face role confusion and feel lost. Key to our learning are our peers and role models. Stage 6. Intimacy versus isolation. As young adults, we slowly understand who we are, and we start to let go of the relationships we had built earlier in order to fit in. We ask ourselves if we can love. If we can make a long-term commitment, we are confident and happy. If we cannot form intimate relationships, we might end up feeling isolated and lonely. Our friends and partners are now central to our development. Stage 7. Generativity versus stagnation. When we reach our 40s, we become comfortable, use our leisure time creatively, and maybe begin contributing to society. Our concern is generativity. If we think that we are able to lead the next generation into this world, we are happy. If we did not resolve some conflicts earlier, we can become pessimistic and experience stagnation. People at home and at work are now who influences them most. Stage 8. Ego integrity versus despair. As we grow older, we tend to slow down and begin to look back over our lives. We ask, how have I done? If we think we did well, we develop feelings of contentment and integrity. If not, we can experience despair and become grumpy and bitter. Time to compare us with mankind. Erik Erikson was a German-American psychologist who, together with his wife Joan, became known for his work on psychosocial development. He was influenced by Sigmund and Anna Freud and became famous for coining the phrase identity crisis. Although Erikson lacked even a bachelor's degree, he served as a professor at Harvard and Yale.
So isn't that interesting? You don't even need a bachelor's degree to become a professor, or at least you didn't back then. The next person up is Paget. That is how you pronounce his name. An awful lot of people mispronounce his name, but it is a French name, so that's why it's pronounced kind of not as it's spelled. But with Paget, we have 4 stages of cognitive development. The sensory motor stage, which is birth to age 2, the pre-operational stage, which is 2 to 7, the concrete operational, 7 to 11, and the formal operational, which is 12 plus. There is another lecture that I have where we actually go into Paget's thing in a little bit more detail. It is one of the childhood development lectures. And I also have a video for him as well. Not quite what I use in the other lecture, but if you are interested, go look at my childhood development lecture.
Piaget's theory argues that we have to conquer 4 stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. Second, the pre-operational stage. Third, the concrete operational stage. And fourth, the formal operational stage. Only once we have gone through all the stages, at what age can vary, we are able to reach full human intelligence. 1. The sensory motor stage, ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop through experiences and movement our 5 senses. Our brain wants to see, hear, smell, taste and touch as much as possible. First, we start with simple reflexes, and soon after we develop our first habits. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond our own body, and then as we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget terms, our realization of object permanence. Before that, our mum can show and then hide a teddy, and we would think it's gone. After, we understand that objects continue to exist, even when we can't see them. We start becoming curious about everything. We want to smell flowers, taste food, listen to sounds, and talk to strangers. To explore more, we move. We learn to sit, crawl, stand, walk, and even to run. This increased physical mobility consequently leads to increased cognitive development. But we remain egocentric, meaning we can perceive the world only from our own point of view. 2. The pre-operational stage, ages 2 to 7. Our thinking is mainly categorized through symbolic functions and intuitive thoughts. We have lots of fantasies and believe objects are alive. As we are not able to apply specific cognitive operations, Piaget calls this stage pre-operational. We learn to speak and understand that words, images, and gestures are symbols for something else. When we draw our family, we are not concerned about drawing each person to scale, but rather with their symbolic meanings. We love to play pretend, which allows us to experience something new and learn a lot. At around age 4, most of us become very curious and ask many questions. We want to know everything. We can call it the birth of primitive reasoning. Piaget calls it the intuitive age, because while we realize that we have a vast amount of knowledge, we have no idea how we acquired it. Our thinking in this stage is still pretty egocentric. We think others see the world like we do, and still don't understand that they see it differently. 3. The concrete operational stage, ages 7 to 11. We finally discover logic, and we develop concrete cognitive operations, such as sorting objects in a certain order. One example of this is inductive reasoning, which means that if we see someone eating a cookie, we can draw a conclusion and then make a generalization. And we now get the concept of conservation. We understand that if we pour orange juice from a normal glass to a taller one, the amount stays the same. Our younger sister will pick the taller glass, thinking she gets more. By the same logic, we only now can understand that if 3 plus 5 equals 8, then 8 minus 3 must equal 5. Our brain learns to rearrange our thoughts, to classify and build concrete operational mental structures. For example, we now know that we can reverse an action by doing the opposite. Excited by our new mental abilities, we apply them in conversations, activities, when we learn to write, and in school. As a result, we get to know ourselves better. We begin to understand that our thoughts and feelings are unique and not necessarily those of others. That means that we learn to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. 4. The formal operational stage, age 12 plus. Once we become teenagers, we become formally operational. We now have the ability to think more rationally about abstract concepts and hypothetical events. Our advanced cognitive abilities allow us to understand abstract concepts such as success and failure, love and hate. We form a deeper understanding of our own identity and our morality. We now also think that we understand why people behave the way they behave, and as a result, can become more compassionate. Our brain can now do deductive reasoning, which means we can compare two statements and reach a logical generalization. Our new mental skills allow us to plan our life systematically and prioritize, and we can make assumptions about events that have no necessary relation to reality. We can now also philosophize and just think about thinking itself. Our new sense for our identity now also creates egocentric thoughts, and some start to see an imaginary audience watching them all the time. Piaget believed in lifelong learning, but insisted that the formal operational stage is the final stage of our cognitive development. Jean Piaget's first interests were animals, and he published his first scientific paper on albino sparrows in 1907 when he was just 11 years old. In 1920, he began working with standardized intelligence tests. He realized that younger children consistently make types of mistakes that older children do not. He concluded that they must think differently and spent the rest of his life studying the intellectual development of children.
Another theory we have is Vygotsky. And with Vygotsky, he really looked into how social learning and relationships with a more knowledgeable other can help play a role in development. With him, he has all these skills that are kind of divided in kind of like a little circle going outwards. The first layer is really from the inside going out. The inside is the skills that you already know, and you're already confident and you've already pretty much mastered. The next layer out is what they call the zone of proximal development. Now, you probably can work on them, but really you need some additional help from an additional person to help guide you towards mastering those skills. And eventually you get, there's another layer that you aren't quite there yet, you probably couldn't even do even with the help of a teacher. So really he does focus on that middle layer, that zone of proximal development, where you just basically need additional help to help speed up that area. And then eventually then everything goes out, then you end up, the next layer might become part of your next zone of proximal development once you've mastered where you are. And with him, he also has this concept of scaffolding, which basically means you take these small, manageable steps, and then you try to reach a goal, learn a skill, or whatnot. For an example, a little child, they really should try to stand up, even with help, and walk around along like an edge before they are able to walk on their own. with that being the eventual goal. With teaching, a lot of teachers do try to use some type of scaffolding, maybe not necessarily physical scaffolding, but certainly taking larger lessons and breaking it down into small, more manageable steps so that their students can go and learn whatever skill that they are trying to do. And of course, we have a thing for Vygotsky as well. I really love these minute videos.
Vygotsky's theory of social development argues that community and language play a central part in learning, while Jean Piaget concluded that children's cognitive development happens in stages. Vygotsky rejected his ideas and believed that children develop independently of specific stages as the result of social interactions. Vygotsky claimed that we are born with 4 elementary mental functions: attention, sensation, perception, and memory. It is our social and cultural environment that allows us to use these elementary skills to develop and finally gain higher mental functions. This development ideally happens in the zone of proximal development. First, there is what we can do on our own. Then, there is the zone of proximal development, which represents what we can do with the help of an adult, a friend, technology, or what Vygotsky called the more knowledgeable other. Last, there is what's beyond our reach. To illustrate this, let us think of twins who were raised in a community in which boys are expected to learn and succeed, while girls are only expected to be pretty. At the age of 10 months, both have the ability to crawl and are in the zone of proximal development for learning how to stand on their feet. The more knowledgeable other, in this case the father, provides the boy with opportunities to practice in a playroom that he has equipped with scaffolding and other objects. The boy is encouraged to explore the equipment, and eventually he uses it to pull himself up. A few hours later, he's cruising along the structures, and a few days later, he's standing on his feet. The girl also has the potential to stand, but does not receive any support in learning the skill. When we compare the two, we see that while the girl is still trying to get up, the boy has moved into a new zone. He knows how to balance while standing and now has the potential to learn how to walk. Both will eventually learn how to walk, but according to Vygotsky, the boy will be more skilled. The same principles apply to all learning and the development of higher cognitive functions, and only those learning with the assistance of a capable mentor can reach the full potential of their ability. Vygotsky therefore believed that inside the zone of proximal development, learning can precede development, which means that a child is able to learn skills that go beyond their natural maturity. He also established an explicit connection between speech and mental concepts, arguing that inner speech develops from external speech via a gradual process of internalization. This means that thought itself develops as a result of conversation. Therefore, younger children who don't finish this process can only think out loud. Once the process is complete, inner speech and spoken language become independent. Lev Vygotsky died of tuberculosis in 1934 at the age of 37. Despite his young age, he became one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. He left the following advice for educators. By giving students practice in talking with others, we give them frames for thinking on their own. What do you think? Can a child learn anything regardless of any developmental prerequisites? And do we learn only through social and cultural contexts? And if so, do you think it is appropriate for a more knowledgeable other to determine what a child should learn next? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Other theories include Skinner's operant conditioning theory. You normally learn about this in the learning modules or the learning chapters. And it's really focused on reward and punishment and how these things are able to really modify our behavior. Then there's also a theory about Bandura's social cognitive theory, which can be taught either in learning or in social psychology. And it really focuses on observational learning and how we learn by watching other people. There's another theory called information processing theory, which when we think about this, this is mostly regarding cognitive psychology and how we are developing in that way. And it's really focusing on thinking about the mind like a computer. And because we can't really quite see what is going on in our mind, we have to look at basically the output. We can look at the input and look at the output, and we try our best way to figure out what is going on inside. And it's really trying to focus on the manipulation of information, monitoring it, and the really strategizing about that. But all those things are a little bit challenging to see in the human brain. But they do consider this to be the best way to understand how children learn, is to observe them while they are learning, which seems to make sense. There are other theories, such as Lorenz and his imprinting studies with the baby geese. He found that there was a critical time period where if mama wasn't around, these baby geese would imprint on basically whatever was closest. And they imprinted on him, and he would walk around and have these baby geese basically following him. There's also Bowlby, who really focused on stuff like attachment to caregivers and how that affects the lifespan. Developmental science and developmental psychology are involved with a lot of different areas of research and have a lot of different things that they are involved with. And that includes things like health and well-being. Developmental science is very interested in stuff like long-term drug effects, for example, and how that can affect your development. One of those examples was a morning sickness medication called thalidomide, which was given to pregnant women in the 50s and the 60s to help prevent morning sickness. If you know anything about morning sickness, first of all, you'll know that it is generally no joke. There is also an evolutionary theory that suggests that morning sickness is actually helping to prevent toxins from getting into the body and disrupting the baby during a critical time period. Unfortunately, this medication was given, and it interacted with the baby in a negative way. Children born by mothers who had been taking this medication frequently had issues, such as some of them did not have arms or legs, some of them had neurological situations. There was a very large list of things, and this was all because this medication was given during a very critical time period and interfered with development. There are, of course, other drugs that people look after. People are very concerned right now with the COVID vaccine, although all evidence shows that it's actually should be pretty safe, but a lot of people are concerned with that long-term effect simply of that vaccine. But I guess we're going to find out in 10, 20 years as to whether it would be better to have had the vaccine or to have had COVID itself. Another thing that gets studied a lot in developmental science is still this whole concept of nature versus nurture. An awful lot of things that come up really are a mixture of nature and nurture, not just one or the other. But people are still really, really worried about proving it one way or the other when, like I said, most things tend to be a mixture of both. Another hot topic is issues of parenting, and even in 2021, the issue of gay adoption is still something that people are studying, and as well as gay parenting in general. And basically, it was thought for a very long time that gay parents, same-sex parents, could not do a very good job at raising the children. Uh, really, a lot of people have already seen that studies have already come out suggesting that gay parents actually usually do a pretty good job. Very frequently, the children raised by them are actually outperforming people, raised the children that were raised by an opposite sex couple. But that's still being studied. Other areas that pop up are things like education. Are people teaching effectively towards different groups of people and at different ages? Are there ways that we could improve this, that, or the other? So that is certainly something. Other areas include stuff like sociocultural context and diversity, looking at how culture, ethnicity, uh, SES, socioeconomic status, gender, and trans issues, and how all of those things can affect development positively, negatively, or if there's additional help that needs to be, given different situations, such as transgender issues or people of different ethnicities. All of those may need an additional hand for one thing or another, and we're just trying to keep everybody at a reasonable rate and try to make sure anybody who is suffering, falling far behind, may actually be able to catch up or improve ways of having people catch up, for example. One of the things that we know is people with lower socioeconomic status and higher stress tend to have challenges with their executive functioning. It does get delayed, and we know that really good quality child care at a very young age, ages 1 through 4 to 5 or so like that, certainly by the age of 3, can actually help improve and reverse the possible problems that there is with the executive functioning. It does help combat that stress and that bullying, for example. Social policies, development it certainly has something to say about the social policies that are occurring. Some of this kicks back to cultural context and diversity. For example, the transgender bathroom bill, which affects me personally as a transgender person, is something that falls under social policy and can affect lots of things about my own personal development, my mental development, whether I am accepted or not, stifling or encouraging me to do whatever I need to do. It also can increase a lot of stress, which can, of course, cause challenges down the road, cause more health problems, etc. There are several states at this point that I'm still not allowed to use the bathroom of my choice, and every employer I have to visit basically has to give me the A-OK to use basically whichever specific bathroom. When I was in medical school, I was still required to use the unisex bathroom, for example. And all this was part of social policy. This caused me to be ostracized from that community because I was not allowed to use the bathroom, and that really affected a lot of things down the road. But there are a lot of other social policies that come into place, such as trying to encourage women to be in different fields, or at the very least not holding them back. So those are lots of other things that you guys can all think about as well. So I challenge you to go off and think about what social policies could also be related to development. So here are some discussion questions, and you can take your time to think about these if you'd like. So what do you think of Erikson's developmental theory and his series of conflicts? Does this fit in with your experience? The following is a quote from Albert Bandura. Humans are producers of their life circumstances, not just products of them. Do you agree, disagree, or maybe in between? How is it that we begin life as babies, who really are very, very similar to each other, and yet we grow into very, very different adults? You can also ask, how do we come to understand ourselves and our relationships with others? Is our social learning experience different from the way we learn about the physical world? Really, it's just some discussion questions to get you started. If you have any questions for me, you guys know where I am. I am here. You can drop me an email. You can drop me a line on the comment, and I will try my best to help you. Thank you so much. Until next time.